The 5 most dangerous men locked in America's Supermax prisons. The metal door slammed so hard it shook the entire hallway of ADX Florence. Guards froze. Cameras zoomed in. And inside one of the isolation units, 5 of the most dangerous men ever locked inside America's Supermax prisons were no longer sitting quietly. One of them, broad shoulders, tattoos creeping up his neck, had managed to slide a sharpened piece of metal from under his mattress. Another inmate, known for planning violent attacks even while locked in total isolation, was shouting codes through the vents. And a third man, someone federal agents once called a one-man nightmare, was pacing in circles like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at anyone who got close. A red light began flashing across the control room. Officers whispered to each other because they had seen this pattern before. When these 5 men moved at the same time, something terrible was about to happen. The prison was supposed to be escape-proof, attack-proof, and chaos-proof. But now, the entire tier felt like it was seconds away from breaking into a violent chain reaction nobody could control. And right when the guards moved toward the unit door, one of the inmates leaned close to the glass and whispered something that made a veteran officer step back in fear. He said, "Tonight, everything changes." The alarm kept blaring. The guards were stuck. If they opened the door, they risked walking into a deadly trap. If they didn't, these 5 men, locked in separate cells, might still find a way to coordinate something inside the most secure prison in America. That's where everything almost went wrong. But to understand how these 5 men ended up becoming the most dangerous inmates locked in America's Supermax prisons, we have to go back to the beginning, before the alarms, before the threats, and before ADX Florence realized that even a concrete fortress can shake. It started years earlier, long before the night everything exploded. One of the men, Daniel Reeves, had arrived first. He was already feared in other federal prisons. Reeves spent most of his time alone, barely talking, barely blinking. Even the transport marshals said he made the air feel cold whenever he stepped inside a room. But in ADX, where inmates lived inside steel and concrete 23 hours a day, Reeves still found ways to stay powerful. He passed coded messages through shower drains. He memorized guard rotations. He learned how to slip tiny objects into places nobody checked. Nothing he did was loud or messy. But every time something dangerous happened, someone attacked, something went missing, his name always came up. Another man came in months later, Marcus Stone Harris. Bigger, louder, and known for never backing down from a fight. Harris entered ADX already carrying a long list of violent acts. By the time he made it to the Supermax, guards whispered that he might be the strongest inmate they had ever seen. But inside ADX, strength wasn't his only threat. Harris had a way of getting inside people's minds. Inmates respected him. Guards feared him. Even in total isolation, he managed to influence people he couldn't even see. The third inmate arrived on a cold morning, Jackson Rivera. Small, quiet, and unbelievably smart. Rivera wasn't the kind of dangers you saw coming. He was the kind you realized too late. Rivera studied everything: the rules, the cameras, the distance between doors, even how long it took a guard to walk from one end of the tier to the other. He never yelled. He never threatened anyone. But his silence, it worried everyone more than any shout could. These 3 were already enough to keep the staff on edge. But then, 2 more arrived. The fourth was a former gang leader named Tyler Briggs, covered in tattoos, known for organizing violent attacks in multiple states. Briggs had enemies everywhere, but he also had followers everywhere. Even in ADX, where no one touched hands or shared a cell, Briggs still somehow kept his influence alive. And the fifth was the one officers feared the most. A man known only by his last name, Cain. He didn't talk. He barely moved. But when he looked at people, they felt like he could see through them. No one knew how he thought, what he planned, or what he wanted. But every psychologist who tried to evaluate him left the room shaken. For a while, these 5 men didn't know each other existed. But slowly, tiny things started happening that didn't make sense. A guard rotation changed without reason. Food trays showed up with patterns scratched into them. A piece of metal vanished from a workshop and was never found. Cameras glitched at the exact same time on different days. Those were the low moments, quiet, strange, almost easy to ignore. But then, something extreme happened. One night, during a routine check, a guard found a message scratched deep into the steel wall inside Rivera's cell. A message he shouldn't have been able to write with anything inside the room. It said, "Midnight. Be ready." Before the officer could react, a loud metallic clang echoed down the hallway as something exploded against the floor of another cell. Something sharp. Something homemade. Something that was never supposed to make it inside a Supermax prison. And that's when everything inside ADX Florence changed in a single second. Because the guards realized these 5 men weren't acting alone. They were acting together. And the next move they made would shake the entire prison. The moment the guards realized all 5 men were working together, the entire prison shifted into panic mode. ADX Florence was designed so inmates could never talk, never touch, never plan anything. Yet somehow, these 5 had done the impossible. And the worst part? Nobody knew what their next move was. The warden ordered an emergency lockdown. Doors slammed shut across the entire compound. Lights flickered. Radios buzzed as officers rushed to their posts. But inside the isolated tier holding these men, everything fell into an eerie silence. Too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Rivera was the first to move. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring straight at the door, tapping his fingers 3 times, pause, then twice. A code. A signal. Somewhere down the hallway, Briggs slammed his fist against his metal bunk exactly 5 seconds later, answering back. Even though they couldn't see each other, they communicated like they shared the same space. This was the low moment, quiet but unsettling, like danger hiding in the shadows. Guards watched the monitors, confused and scared. "How are they doing this?" one officer whispered. "No one talks at ADX," another replied. "No one." But then came the part that made everyone's stomach drop. Harris, the strongest one, began pulling on the vent cover in his cell. Nobody knew he had been loosening the screws for weeks with nothing but friction and time. He wrapped his hands around the metal, took a deep breath, and with a loud, bone-deep grunt, screech, the entire vent cover ripped loose. The metal plate hit the floor with a crash so loud it echoed like thunder. The guards jumped to their feet. They rushed to his cell, ready to intervene, but Harris was already backing away from the wall, smiling. Not because he wanted to escape. No one escapes ADX. But because he wanted the guards to know. "We're not done," he whispered to the camera. That single act sent the control room into a frenzy. If Harris could break a vent cover, what could the other 4 be doing? A team rushed to Rivera's cell. They expected him to be tearing the place apart. Instead, they found something worse. He had rearranged small objects in a perfect pattern. Soap, toothpaste cap, a folded sheet, all aligned like a map. Rivera kept staring at the wall, whispering numbers under his breath as if he were calculating something no one else could see. Another guard checked Cain's cell. "Bad idea." The moment he stepped close, Cain slowly turned and pressed his hand against the glass, revealing something dark drawn across his palm using pieces of ink scraped from books. It was a symbol. No one recognized it. But the look in his eyes told them it wasn't just random. That was the low moment, silent fear crawling through the prison. But the extreme moment came fast, sudden, and violent. As officers moved down the tier, something slid under Briggs' door. A small object. A piece of sharpened plastic, smooth-shaped, deadly. It skidded across the floor and stopped at the boots of a sergeant. Briggs stood there, staring through the tiny window, tattoos glowing under the dim light. He said one sentence that froze the entire squad. "You're already too late." Before the sergeant could react, alarms exploded again. Reha-ha-ha. Every light on the tier turned red. Something had gone wrong elsewhere. Rivera stood up fast. Harris laughed. Briggs stepped back from the door. Reeves closed his eyes. Cain didn't move at all. He didn't have to. Because the guards had just realized something horrifying. Whatever these 5 men were planning, the first part had already begun. The red lights kept flashing, but this time, it wasn't coming from the tier holding the 5 men. It was coming from deeper inside ADX Florence. Guards sprinted down the corridor, radios crackling with panic. Something had gone wrong in a completely different unit, one that none of these inmates were physically connected to. Which meant only one thing. Somehow, the 5 most dangerous men had triggered chaos somewhere else in the prison. This was the low moment, confusion spreading like smoke. Officers yelled over each other. "Check C block." No, the alert came from D unit. "Somebody patch into the cameras." When the monitors finally loaded, everyone in the control room froze. A door in a distant pod had opened by itself. No inmate inside that pod had remote access. No inmate could push a button to unlock it. Only someone in the control system could have triggered the mechanism. But no guard had done it. No one. Rivera. It had to be Rivera. He had been studying the camera angles, counting guard steps, tapping codes. They didn't know how he did it, but he must have found a way to exploit a weakness in the timing system. ADX was built like a fortress, but even a fortress has cracks. Guards rushed to the rogue pod, hearts pounding. When they reached it, they found the inmate inside standing in the middle of the room, confused, terrified, and shaking his head. It just opened, he stuttered. I didn't touch nothing. The officers cuffed him anyway, trying to calm the chaos. Meanwhile, back in the five-man tier, everything looked strangely calm. Too calm. Reeves sat on his bed with his head down, lips moving quietly like he was reciting something. His fingers traced invisible lines on his knee. It looked harmless, until a guard realized he was drawing the layout of the prison from memory. Harris stood near his vent, gripping the metal frame he had ripped off earlier, lifting it like a weight and dropping it again. Boom, boom, boom. Each thunderous crash made dust fall from the ceiling. The guards couldn't tell if he was just flexing, or counting each slam like part of a schedule. Briggs rubbed chalky pieces of soap across his arm tattoos, darkening the designs until they looked new again, sharper, clearer, like symbols he wanted someone to see. And Cain hadn't moved at all. He stared at the floor like he was listening to something nobody else could hear. This was the low part, quiet but dangerous. But then the extreme hit. A guard doing routine rounds bent to slide a food tray under Rivera's door. Rivera didn't move. He didn't look up. His voice, barely above a whisper, said, "Step back." The guard froze. "What did you say?" Rivera's eyes shifted upward, slowly, like each movement was perfectly calculated. "Step back." The officer backed away fast, unsure why. Then he saw it. The food tray was smoking. Thin wisps of gray smoke curled upward from under the metal. Rivera had poured something on the tray, something chemical, something from inside the cell that should have been harmless on its own but mixed with heat or friction, was now reacting. "What is that?" the officer yelled as he pulled back. Rivera stood up. "Come. Controlled." His voice didn't rise at all. "You're behind schedule," he said. Before the officers could react. Boom. A sharp pop blasted through the tier. The tray didn't explode like a bomb, but it ignited in a flash of heat that sent sparks across the concrete floor. Rivera stepped back, shielding his face. The guards jumped away, radios screaming for backup. Harris laughed from his cell. Briggs clapped once, slow and mocking. Reeves lifted his head. Cain closed his eyes like he had been waiting for that exact moment. The alarms roared again, louder, longer, more urgent than before. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a random burst of chaos. This was a signal. A message sent from Rivera to the other four. A message that said, "The plan has started." And the guards knew, with sinking fear, that this was only the first step, and the next step would be much worse. Smoke drifted down the hallway like a warning. Officers dragged fire extinguishers across the floor, spraying Rivera's burning tray until the sparks died. But the danger wasn't the fire. It was the realization that Rivera had used nothing more than everyday items inside a Supermax cell to create a reaction powerful enough to trigger alarms. If he could do that with scraps, what could the other four do? This was the low moment, a tense, nervous silence settling over the tier. But the silence didn't last. The guards gathered in front of Rivera's cell, demanding answers. "What did you mix? Where did you get those materials? How long have you been planning this?" Rivera simply stepped into the dim light, tilted his head and said, "You're asking the wrong questions." Then he backed into the shadows. Before the guards could press further, another officer shouted from the far end of the tier, "Check Harris. Now." The team sprinted down the hallway toward Harris's cell. He stood there, muscles tight, fists clenched, breathing heavily. But the danger wasn't him, it was the vent cover he had ripped off earlier. The guards noticed something that made their stomachs drop. Harris had sharpened the edges. He had been dragging the metal along the concrete walls over and over, smoothing it into a blade. It wasn't fully sharp yet, but another hour? Another 40 minutes? That thing could cut through bone. A guard yelled, "Step away from the vent." Harris smiled and held the metal sheet up casually, like it weighed nothing. "You came late," he said. "Very late." The officers raised their shields, ready for him to charge the door, but he didn't. He dropped the metal and stepped back. It clattered across the floor. That was the low moment. The fake-out. The quiet before the next hit. Because on the other side of the tier, something else was happening. Briggs. He had been pacing his cell, muttering under his breath. The tattoos on his arms looked freshly marked, dark and sharp, like he had re-inked them with some kind of homemade dye. The guards didn't understand the meaning until they zoomed in. Each symbol was part of a coded message. Connections to old gang allies, warnings, instructions. Briggs wasn't sending messages inside the prison. He was preparing messages for outside the prison. "Open the door slot," Briggs demanded. "No," the officer said calmly. Briggs leaned close to the glass. Open it. No. Then Briggs whispered something that drained the color from the officer's face. Check the cameras. He's moving. The guards didn't know who he was, but they ran anyway straight back to the monitors. That's when they saw it. Cain. The quiet, unreadable man in cell 5. The one nobody could predict. The one who never spoke, never reacted, never even blinked when danger filled the room. Cain was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding something in his hand. Something small. Something shiny. Something that looked like a piece of broken glass. The guards panicked. Where did he get that? There's no glass in his cell. Someone check his room now. But Cain didn't move. He held the object between his fingers, turning it slowly, calmly, like he was studying his reflection in it. That was the low moment. The stillness. The dread. Then came the extreme moment that made the entire control room gasp. Cain looked directly into the camera, straight into the lens, and dragged the sharp object across the concrete floor. Scrape. 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 He was carving something. A single word. The camera zoomed in. Officers leaned forward. The word was, begin. Seconds later, brave. Every alarm in the prison went off at once. Red lights. Screaming sirens. Automatic locks slamming into place. The 5 men didn't react in fear. They reacted like they had been waiting for this. Rivera stepped forward. Harris cracked his knuckles. Briggs smirked. Reeves lifted his head. Cain stood up slowly, like a storm rising from the floor. The guards knew instantly. They weren't stopping a plan anymore. They were entering the plan. And the next step would push ADX Florence to the edge of total collapse. The alarms kept howling like the entire prison was under attack. Officers rushed down the hallway, but the moment they reached the steel doors of the tier, they stopped cold. Something didn't feel right. The lights above them flickered, bright, dim, bright again, like someone was tampering with the electrical system. This was the low moment. The confusion. The fear. The sense that the prison was slipping out of their control. The warden's voice barked over the radio. Secure the tier. Do not open any doors until we understand what's happening. But the guards already knew they weren't dealing with a random emergency. They were dealing with the 5 most dangerous men in the entire Supermax system, moving like they shared the same brain. Inside their cells, the men weren't panicking. They were preparing. Reeves, the quiet mastermind, sat on the edge of his bed, breathing slowly, calmly. His fingers dragged across the floor, tracing invisible lines like he was mapping the entire prison from memory. Every shadow, every camera, every door. Reeves didn't talk often, but when he did, people listened. And right now, even in silence, he was leading. Harris, the unstoppable force, tightened the blanket around his fists. He knew fighting wasn't the first part of the plan, it was the last. And when that time came, he'd be the one to bring the chaos. His muscles were tight, ready. His eyes focused like he was counting down from 10 in his head. Briggs stood against the wall, tattoos shining under the dim light, each symbol a message, each line a command. He was the connection, the one who had influence beyond ADX. Even locked inside concrete and steel, his reach was long. Too long. Rivera sat on the floor, legs crossed, tapping patterns on the concrete. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Each rhythm matched the timing of something. No one knew what, but he did. Cain. Oh, Cain. He stood perfectly still in the center of his cell, the small sharp object still held in his hand. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe loudly. But when the lights flickered again, Cain lifted his head and smiled for the first time. The guards felt the temperature drop as they watched the screens. Then the extreme moment hit. A violent boom exploded from the far left side of the tier. What was that? A guard screamed. Smoke spilled out from underneath Reeves' door, thick, dark, choking. The officers rushed toward the cell, shields raised. They expected fire. An explosion. Something dangerous. But when they opened the viewing slot, a chilling scene appeared. Reeves stood in the middle of his cell, smiling calmly. On the floor behind him, his metal toilet was overflowing with water, dark and muddy. Sparks popped from the outlet above it. He had jammed something inside the toilet drain to force water backward, flooding the wiring behind the wall. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to fight. He was trying to kill the power. And he had succeeded. The lights flickered once. Then everything went black. The entire tier plunged into darkness. Guards shouted. Radios died. Cameras went blank. Every officer froze because they knew. When ADX loses power, even for a few seconds, The electronic locks reboot. And that reboot time? Exactly 12 seconds. 12 seconds where doors didn't respond. 12 seconds where cameras were blind. 12 seconds where chaos could slip through. Flashlights snapped on. Guards shoved each other trying to reach their positions. Watch Rivera. Check Cain. Get to Briggs' door now. Harris is moving, somebody stop him. But it was too late. Because in the darkness, they heard it. A sound that made every officer's stomach drop. Click. One of the doors had just unlocked. But they didn't know which one. Then another click. Then a third. Rivera whispered, "Perfect timing." Briggs laughed deep and slow. Reeves closed his eyes like everything was going exactly as planned. And Cain? Cain stepped forward, into the dark. As the lock on his cell began to cycle. The guards couldn't see. They couldn't hear clearly. They couldn't think straight. All they knew was this. One of the 5 most dangerous men in America was about to walk out of his cell. Flashlights sliced through the pitch-black hallway, shaking in officers' trembling hands. Every guard knew what those clicks meant. Electronic locks restarting, cycling open for a split second before the backup system kicked in. Normally it wasn't a problem. But tonight it was a nightmare. This was the low moment where fear took over the entire unit. A guard yelled, "Count the doors. Count the doors." But they couldn't. The blackout turned the tier into a maze of shadows and echoes. Every metal door looked the same. Every sound bounced off concrete walls. No one could tell which lock had moved, or if more were about to. Then, slowly, the emergency lights flickered back on, dim red beams that made the hallway look like something out of a horror scene. The guards scanned the cells fast. Reeves was still inside his. Briggs was still inside his. Rivera was sitting calmly in the center, waiting. But Harris was standing at the very edge of his open door. It wasn't open enough for him to squeeze out, but it was open enough for him to wedge his hands into the gap. "Don't move," the guards yelled. Harris smiled. Too late. With a thunderous roar, he pushed his entire weight into the crack. Muscles bulging, veins rising, feet sliding across the floor. Grrrah! The metal bent. Just a little. But bending a Supermax steel door even 1 inch was like bending a car frame. The guards charged forward with shields, trying to pin him back inside before he forced the door any farther. The hallway shook as they slammed into the barrier. This was the low moment. A dangerous struggle, but one the guards might still win. Then the extreme moment struck. A loud, sharp clang, echoing from behind them. They whipped around. It was Cain, standing inside his cell. Door wide open. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't taken advantage of the darkness. He just stood there. Silent. Still. Staring. That was what made it terrifying. Cain didn't try to run. Cain didn't try to fight. Cain didn't try to hide. He simply stepped forward, just one slow step like he was testing the air. A guard shouted, "Back up. Back up now." Cain lifted his hand, the same hand with the small, sharp object, and held it up to the emergency light. The tiny shard glowed red. Then he dropped it on the floor. The object shattered. A message. He didn't need it anymore. Now the guards had 2 choices and both were bad. Stop Harris before he ripped the door off its hinges. Stop Cain before he stepped out of his cell completely. They couldn't do both. And that's when Rivera, sitting calmly in his cell, whispered loud enough for the hallway to hear. "Check the floor." Everyone froze. "What floor?" a guard yelled. Rivera didn't blink. "Yours." The officers looked down and saw a trail of water running across the concrete. A thin line that stretched from Reeves' flooded toilet all the way to the electrical panel near the guards' feet. Before they could move, zap. A violent surge of sparks exploded from the panel, blasting the hallway with blinding white light. Guards stumbled backward, yelling, shields clattering against walls. The emergency lights flickered again. Reeves stood up. Briggs pressed both palms to his door. Harris roared, still forcing the door open. Cain took another step forward. Rivera leaned back with a calm smile and whispered, "Phase 2. The guards realized the horrifying truth. The 5 most dangerous men in America weren't improvising. They weren't reacting. They were following a plan. A detailed, coordinated plan. And the next step was already in motion. The hallway smelled like burnt wires and wet concrete. Sparks still crackled inside the electrical panel as guards staggered to their feet, blinking through the flashing emergency lights. The trail of water across the floor kept spreading, thin but steady, like Reeves had calculated exactly how fast it would travel. This was the low moment. The confusion. the fear creeping in. The sense that the tier wasn't just dangerous, it was alive with their plan. Officers regained their positions, shields up, batons raised. But nothing felt right. Nothing felt safe. Then came the first pressure point. Harris. He was still gripping the edge of his door, muscles bulging, forcing the steel open inch by inch. The whole frame groaned under the pressure. A sergeant shouted, "Push him back. Now." They slammed their shields into the door. Thud, thud, thud. Harris didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He pushed back just once. A single explosive shove. And the guards stumbled like they had been hit by a moving car. That was the low moment. But it wasn't the extreme. Not yet. Because suddenly, from the opposite side of the tier, Briggs slammed his fist against his cell window. Boom. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Briggs grinned as the guard spun toward him. "You're facing the wrong direction," he said. They turned back. And froze. Cain was now fully outside his cell. Not running. Not charging. Not screaming. Just standing there in the middle of the hallway, calm as stone, his hands lowered at his sides. A guard raised his baton, voice trembling. "Cain, don't move." Cain tilted his head slightly, like he was listening for something far away. Then he said, in a voice so soft it almost didn't sound human, "He's here." The guards looked at one another in confusion. "Who's here?" Cain didn't answer. Because the answer came from behind them. A sharp, metallic click. The sound of another door unlocking. The guards spun around, eyes wide, flashlights shaking. And that's when the extreme moment hit. Reeves' door slid open. Not fully. Not enough for him to escape. But enough for him to extend his arm. In that single moment, Reeves revealed that he wasn't just the silent strategist. He was the one who had timed the blackout to the exact second. Reeves leaned into the crack and whispered, "You're out of time." Then the power surged. Boom. A violent burst of electricity exploded through the panel, up the wall and into the ceiling. The lights flickered so hard the hallway flashed white, then dimmed again to blood red. Rivera jumped to his feet. Briggs stepped back from his door. Harris let go of the frame and cracked his neck. Cain took one more step toward the center of the hallway. And then, every lock on the tier made the same sound. Click, 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 click. The guards gasped. They froze where they stood. Their radios screamed with static. Every inmate door on the tier had just cycled. Not open, but ready. Rivera spoke first. "Phase 3. Harris grinned. Briggs nodded. Reeves lowered his head like a general preparing for a final command. Cain closed his eyes. The guards didn't know what Phase 3 was. But they were about to find out. Because across the prison, deep inside another unit, a second alarm began screaming. The 5 men turned their heads in perfect sync. The plan wasn't happening in just one tier. It was happening across multiple parts of ADX Florence. And the next extreme event was seconds away. The second alarm rang through the entire prison like a warning shot. Guards froze. Even the emergency lights flickered as if the building itself felt the danger spreading. This wasn't a simple malfunction anymore. This was coordination. Intentional. Calculated. And every guard on the tier knew the truth. The 5 most dangerous men in America weren't just causing chaos in their unit. They had triggered something somewhere else in the prison. This was the low moment. The moment when officers scrambled for answers, for control, for anything that made sense. Radios crackled with confused voices. "Report from C block, something's wrong. The unit just locked itself down. Someone tampered with the timing system again. We can't stop it." Back on the tier, the guards tightened their formation. Shields up. Batons ready. Their hearts hammered as they watched the 5 men. Reeves stood calmly at his door, one eye visible through the crack. Rivera pressed both hands against the floor, tapping lightly. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. Harris rolled his shoulders like he was warming up. Briggs stepped into the faint red light, tattoos glowing like fresh ink. Cain, simply breathe. Slow. Controlled. Like he was listening for the next signal. The guards shouted commands, trying to pull the unit back under control. Cain, stop moving. Rivera, step away from the wall. Harris, hands where we can see them. But none of the men obeyed. This was the low moment, tense but quiet. Until the extreme moment arrived. A loud KRZZZT burst overhead, the speakers in the ceiling cut on and off like someone was forcing their way into the system. A harsh buzzing replaced the usual officer voices. Then, suddenly, through the distortion, a voice came through. Someone wasn't supposed to have access. Someone wasn't supposed to speak over the prison communication system. But the guards heard it clearly. Phase 3, confirmed. The officers froze. That voice. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't a warden. It wasn't staff. It was an inmate from another unit. Rivera grinned. Briggs lowered his head in satisfaction. Harris laughed under his breath. Reeves whispered, "Right on time." Cain looked up at the speaker like it was a sunrise. The guards panicked, shouting into their radios. Who just accessed the comms? Locate the source. Cut the speakers. Now. But before they could figure out where the voice came from, boom. A cell door near the middle of the tier shook violently, as if someone inside had slammed their entire weight into it. The guards flinched and rushed toward it. Another boom. This time from the far right. Then a third boom. From behind them. The entire tier erupted with sound. Bang, bang, bang. Inmates in surrounding cells, not the 5 masterminds, began pounding, kicking, shouting. Something had triggered them too. Something had spread beyond the 5. The guards realized the horrifying truth. These 5 men had used the blackout to send signals not just to each other, but to other inmates across the prison. The riot energy started building even though no one was free. No one had escaped. No one had touched a guard. Yet the air felt explosive. This was the low moment, fear, confusion, chaos rising. Then the extreme hit. A guard stepped back from the pounding doors and slipped in the thin layer of water still crawling across the floor. He fell hard, dropping his flashlight, which skidded toward Cain. The beam landed right at Cain's feet. Cain slowly bent down, picked up the flashlight and held it, gently. Not as a weapon. As if he was testing its weight. The guard closest to him shouted, "Drop it." Cain didn't. He turned the flashlight toward his own door, and shined it inside. Revealing something none of the guards were prepared to see. Inside Cain's cell, on the wall behind his bed, was a massive, perfectly drawn diagram. Not random scratches. Not chaotic lines. A full layout of the tier. Every door. Every vent. Every camera. Every guard station. He had drawn the entire place from memory. Rivers of panic rushed through the officers. Cain lowered the beam and whispered, "Phase 4, begins now." Before anyone could react. Click. One more cell door unlocked. And this time, it wasn't Cain. It wasn't Rivera. It wasn't Reeves, Briggs, or Harris. It was someone else. Someone the guards didn't even consider dangerous. Someone they had never suspected. Someone who had been quietly watching everything unfold. The tier suddenly went silent. Because now, for the first time tonight, there were 6 inmates in the plan. And the guards had no idea what this new one was capable of.